I'm happy to welcome and introduce our next presenter. Dr. Jeffrey Dukes is a professor of forestry and natural resources and biological sciences at Purdue University. In addition to being director of the Climate Change Research Center and the Belker Chair for Environmental Sustainability. With his research, Dr. Dukes seeks to address environmental challenges through ecological research and outreach. His research currently focuses on three themes: understanding how ecosystems respond to climate and atmospheric change, understanding and minimizing the impacts of invasive species on ecosystems, and exploring the ecological consequences of switching our energy supply from fossil fuels to biofuels. Dukes also leads the Interface Research Coordination Network, which brings together experimentalists and modelers from around the world to advance global environmental change research. Quickly, I'd like to just add a reminder that guests can type in their questions into the chat during the presentations. But other than that, I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Jeffrey Dukes.
So thanks for having me back. I'm going to talk today about the implications of climate change for metropolitan planning, and really, I say what's new in 2021. The reality is that the story hasn't changed much since last year. We have some new reports that are out. I will talk about some sort of the latest developments on some fronts, but the basic picture is the same. I don't have a sense for how many of you saw my talk last year and how many of you did not. But one of the things I did last year was talk about the different ways that climate is going to change in Indiana, and I suspect that that's important for this crowd to know. And so in case some of you were not there, I want to make sure I go over that again. So I'll start out today by talking about changes that are happening at the global scale. We'll bring that down to the more local scale, look at how Indiana might be how the climate in Indiana might change and some of the impacts that might have. We'll talk in various ways about what we can do to minimize the bad impacts of climate change. First of all, through adaptation, or basically doing things on the ground that are going to minimize the impacts of climate change, and then also by mitigation, so things that we're doing societally to minimize the amount of climate change that we get. And some of those have implications for what's happening on the ground as well. I think we're going to go through, and we're in the midst of really already a major energy transition that's going to have growing implications for what our land cover looks like, what is present on the ground in our communities and around them. And so we'll talk about how our responses may transform the landscape. And then at the end, I'll try to just mention some resources that might be of use to some of you. And I mentioned at least some of them last time I talked as well, but they may be new to some of you as well. So that's my plan. And we'll start out with the really big picture here, which is just looking at Earth's average temperature over the last 2,000 years. Looking at this is the reconstruction of Earth's temperature from a variety of records, like tree rings, for instance, and borehole temperatures and ice records. They're all put together in the over the last sort of 2,000 year record here, and then in the black on the left, over the last 170 years or so, you can see the observed temperatures as recorded by thermometers. What this does is just put into context the changes that we have seen in the global average temperature recently. The warming that we've seen is unprecedented in the 2,000 year record that's shown here. And there's a bar on the left-hand side of this screen here that shows the average temperatures across different multi-century periods over the last 100,000 years. And what you can see is we're now exiting even the range of average temperatures that the planet has experienced in the last 100,000 years. So the warming that's happening right now, that has already happened, is very much out of character for the planet in the rate, and we're getting into a range that is unusual as well, a range of temperatures that's unusual. If we just narrow this down to the 1880 to 2019 timeframe. Here you can see what was the black line before stretched out as the white line here. At the same time, you can see the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, the average annual carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere graphed in red. And these are superimposed on each other because the increase in carbon dioxide is really the dominant mechanism through which our global temperature is rising. It's not the only thing contributing to the increase in temperature, but it's the major thing contributing to the increase in temperature. And of course, the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is rising because we are burning lots of fossil fuels, primarily for energy use, to heat our buildings, to transport ourselves around the planet, for a wide variety of purposes, industry, you name it. Where is the climate headed? Well, we're warming so fast, the future really depends on us. So this graph here again shows that same line of observed temperatures, this time just from 1950 to 2015 on the left-hand side in the black bar. But then the future temperatures are projections from a bunch of different Earth system models that are basically used to look at what temperatures we would expect to see on the planet with different amounts of heat trapping gases in the atmosphere. And so this is the sort of deciding which color line we head into the future on is the sort of thing that's being discussed this coming week in Glasgow and Scotland. The different countries are trying to negotiate what everyone's contribution will be towards bending the curve downwards into the cooler colors on this graph. And where we'll actually end up is anyone's guess. Hopefully we're on track now not to be on either of the red lines. Hopefully we'll bend down from that a bit. Maybe we'll even get below the yellow line, but it's not entirely clear. The commitments that countries make and the reality of what they do aren't always the same. So one thing to be aware of here is that you see a dramatic range of possible future temperatures, global average temperatures at the 2100 mark, so at the end of this century. But if you look forward just a few decades, there's actually not a huge spread. No matter which scenario you're chugging along on, we're going to see additional warming over the next few decades. And so we need to prepare for the warming that is pretty much locked in the system because of all the infrastructure that we already have in place. At the same time as we're hopefully trying to bend that curve down towards 2100 and minimize the challenges that future generations face, as well as our own generations in the decades after the coming few. So I am the director of the Purdue Climate Change Research Center, and one of the things that we have done while I've been director is look in depth at how the climate is changing in Indiana, how it's expected to change in the future, and what the implications of that might be for Indiana on a variety of different levels. We've been doing this in collaboration with people from many other universities and organizations around the state. We've issued a variety of reports, and in the climate report, you can see that our state has gotten warmer already. If you look back over the last 125 years or so, we've gotten 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. There's a lot of year-to-year variability in our average temperature, but there is a warming trend, and it's a more obvious warming trend if you just look over the last 50 years. We've actually warmed a lot less than many other parts of the country and the world, but this is where we are now. There's a variety of possible reasons for that, and if somebody wants to ask about that later, you're welcome to. We have longer frost-free seasons now than we used to. We have fewer cold days than we used to, and our minimum temperatures are what have increased the most dramatically. So we have significantly warmer overnight temperatures than we used to. Maybe more dramatic than the change in temperatures we've seen is the change in precipitation. So on average around the state, we now get 6.5 more inches of rainfall per year than we did 125 years ago or so. it's just a remarkably wetter state, and it's not uniform. This increase in precipitation has been much greater in the southern part of the state than it has in the northeastern part of the state. But everywhere is getting wetter, and at the same time that precipitation is coming down in heavier events. So throughout much of the Midwest, there's been an increase of 42% in the amount of rain that's come down in the heaviest events, and this is over the past 60 years or so. So we're seeing more extreme rainfall than we used to, and obviously that has that brings challenges related to flooding and related to erosion in different places. We're also seeing more days or more events in which we're having heavy rains than we used to. So this is basically the same sort of this is just a different way of quantifying the same sort of trend as you saw in the last slide. We have more days per year on average where precipitation exceeds the 99th percentile event, like these really heavy events. So along with this additional rain and additional precipitation that we have and these heavier rainfall events and snowfall events, we have seen that our stream flows have increased. So the average annual water level or flow rate really in our different streams is going up. Each of these circles represents a stream gauge somewhere in the state on one of our streams or rivers, and the circles, if they're blue, they mean that the stream levels have been rising. If they're dark blue, it's statistically significant rise, and the rate of change is shown with the size of the circle. So the thing to really see here is that there's a lot more blue than red. The red dots indicate the places where stream levels have been falling, and basically everywhere it's blue. This could be happening for a couple different reasons. I mean, this could be happening not just because the rain is coming down more, but it can also happen if you have more drainage tile in the agricultural fields in a region, or if, as I'm sure you all know, if you have more impermeable surfaces where runoff is happening, and so you're getting more of the water going into the creeks and less of the water evaporating and going up into the atmosphere. So there's many possible causes for this, but we have seen this increase in precipitation, and so that's certainly a major contributor to these changes as well. So the big question is, going forward, if we're going to be planning literally for the future, should we expect these sorts of changes to continue? The spoiler here is yes, we should, but that's something we've been looking at as part of the climate change, the Indiana Climate Change Impact Assessment. And what the models suggest is that Indiana will get warmer. So the average annual temperature, as I mentioned before, has already increased by 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit over the last century, or a little more than a century. The warming is actually expected to accelerate going forward in Indiana. We looked at this by taking 10 different climate models that were really the 10 global climate models that did the best job of representing our state's climate. We then looked at what those models projected the future would look like for Indiana under two different scenarios, a medium emission scenario and a high emission scenario. We were, I guess you could say, a little bit pessimistic when we started this out that there would be that we would be able to achieve a low emission scenario going forward. We thought the medium emission scenario was maybe more realistic as to what the future might hold, and the high emission scenario is a worst case scenario. And I would say at this point it looks pretty unlikely that we'll go down that path. So the medium emission scenario, I think, is still achievable as something that we could get to if there are still major changes in society in terms of our energy use, for instance, going forward. But you'll be seeing in the next slides, you'll be seeing medium emission scenario or high emission scenario, and you should just know that the medium is sort of a ambitious but achievable future, and the high would really be a worst case scenario. So we expect our warming in this part of the world is going to continue and accelerate, By mid-century, we expect 5 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit of warming over the historical levels of warming, and 6 degrees would be that high scenario, that's worst case. 5 degrees would be under the medium scenario. So this includes some of the warming, some of that 1.3 degrees warming that I talked about already, but we're talking about something like maybe an additional 4 degrees warming of our average temperatures here in the state of Indiana by mid-century. What does that mean for us? It means fewer mild days. Mild days are the nice days that are maybe between, say, 68 and 85 degrees, days that are fun to go outside and you're not really thinking about the weather other than the fact that you can be happy outdoors without thinking about it. We could lose a few weeks of those mild days by mid-century. We expect more hot days in these scenarios and extremely hot days, a longer warm season and a milder cold season on average around the state. It's all things you'd expect with the increase in average temperature. To give you some sort of vision of this in terms of days above 90 degrees, talking about hot days here, this is the historical number of days where you had 90-degree temperatures or greater around the state in the different counties across the state. And under a medium emissions scenario, I can show you what we would expect by mid-century. The point is, on that slide there, we expect a dramatic increase in dramatic increase in the number of days, those hot days that hit 90 degrees plus in the well, by the 2041 to 2070 period. So what do hot days mean? They mean you know, more stress on the pavement during those days when we have now, you know, a few times more hot days essentially in some of these cases across these counties. More pavement stress, more water demand from the plants, higher health risks for outdoor workers who are facing the possibility of heat stroke and heat exhaustion. Reductions in air quality because ozone basically is created faster out of the chemicals that are released into the atmosphere under warmer conditions. So these really hot days are problematic for us in many ways, for our health and safety. We expect more freeze-thaw cycles, and that has implications for things like potholes, which you see the close-up of here. So in the past, we would get about 2 to 6 events per year in February. Going forward to mid-century, we can expect perhaps 4 to 7 freeze-thaw events, depending on where you are in the state. So that's more challenges for keeping up roads. At the same time, we're getting wetter. As I mentioned before, we have increased our annual average precipitation by 6.5 inches over the last century, on top of we have about 42 inches per year average in the state. Varies in different parts of the state, but that's a reasonable sort of average number. We expect that the precipitation is going to continue increasing. Basically, we'll get another 6 to 8% of annual rainfall by mid-century, but the important thing to know is that that's not uniform across the year. We expect to actually get substantially wetter, 16 to 20% wetter in winter, and similar amount wetter, 13 to 16% wetter in spring. More of that precipitation will fall as rain and not snow, because that's the cold season when we would get snow potentially, but it'll be warmer than it was in the past, and so we'll get more of that precipitation falling down as rain. This will lead to early season soil saturation, even more than we have now, and that's going to pose a challenge for farmers, for instance, who are always worried about trying to get into the field those times of year. In contrast, during the summer and the fall, we don't have any evidence really across these models that it's going to get wetter. On average, the models project slight declines in precipitation during those seasons, but this is an area where the models disagree. So some models suggest slightly better, some models suggest slightly drier, some models suggest very little change at all. In contrast, all the models suggest warming, and they all suggest that we'll get wetter conditions in the winter and spring. If we don't get any more water, or not much more water in the summer and fall, that's a challenge for growing plants, because there will be increased demand for water because of the warmer temperatures. The plants will need more water essentially, but they may not have it, so the soils will end up being drier. The added precipitation in winter and spring is going to lead to more water flowing out of drainage tiles in different parts of the state. We're projecting somewhere from basically 25 to 40% more drainage tile flow by mid-century under the medium emission scenario. And so, of course, that just leads to more challenges in terms of controlling that water downstream, minimizing the possibility that that contributes to flooding. Since this is water coming from agricultural fields, there are water quality issues with that. There could be more nutrient runoff. And so these sorts of numbers mean that the practices that farmers implement on their fields are going to become really important, because those will help determine exactly how much water is coming out of those drainage tiles in the future. The upshot of this, and this is data from the much delayed water report from the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment that I think is likely to come out within a couple months now. But in any case, the upshot is that basically we're going to get in the rivers the higher highs and lower lows. So here in the black line, you see the average flow here for the White River at a stream gauge near Indianapolis. And you see that its highest levels are typically in the spring, in March and April. And what we expect is going forward under the medium emission scenario in the 2050s and 2080s, we'll get substantially higher peak flows or higher monthly average flows during that winter and spring period. And in the summer, we expect that the flows are actually going to be lower than they have been historically. And so you'll have challenges managing the water and consideration of changes in floodplains in the spring and winter, and in the summer when you may be needing to manage flow or thinking about pollution in the streams or implications for wildlife. Those challenges could be exacerbated by the lower flows during those times. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about adaptation and whether we are ready for the changes that are coming and what we can do to get ready. Basically, the best way to adapt to these problems is not to have them in the first place. So if we don't put people and infrastructure in vulnerable locations, as was reported in this National Research Council assessment, if we don't put things in trouble's way, then we won't have to deal with it afterwards. So so planning becomes really important in avoiding some of these impacts of climate change, making sure that we're putting things in good places for them, not just today, but putting things in places that will be appropriate in 30 years or 70 years as well. So we need to be thinking about climate change impacts on our infrastructure investments, both existing and our future infrastructure. And we need to be really integrating our land use planning and our transportation planning to make sure that we don't have, we aren't creating problems for our future selves or for our future generations, because we haven't been thinking about how things like stream flows might change. A report from last year that was billed as this first national flood risk assessment from First Street Foundation suggests that flood risk is underestimated in many communities and should be reassessed. And so this is something that's important to keep in mind when thinking about flood risks in any given location. So I think it's worth thinking about, our past experiences that we've had with extreme events still a reliable indicator for what future risks might be. I think in many cases the answer to that would be no. We have seen that the frequency and magnitude of extreme rainfall events are going to change in this state, and it Also, we expect that stream flows and flooding are going to shift. So how do we deal with that? Certainly, there's been federal support to deal with stormwater systems so that we don't have as many, basically as many wastewater overflow events or sort of pollution events in our rivers. But we need to be, and those will help with some of these climate change impacts. But we need to be keeping these in mind when we're designing this sort of infrastructure, our stormwater infrastructure, for instance. Also, when we're designing bridges, we need to be thinking about how peak flows might change. We need to be thinking about the pavement that's going on those bridges. Is it appropriate for future hotter conditions? Is there going to be room for those sections to expand and contract with increasingly warm days in the future? And is the pavement the type that's going to be able to take more extreme heat in the summer? Of course, urban land management is very important in thinking about adapting to climate change, and obviously, you folks know urban land management includes many different components, whether it's the planning or whether it's the zoning that happens, the infrastructure that gets built. All this is just pointed out in a technical input paper for the 2014 National Climate Assessment. The point being really that we need to take a systems approach if we're going to achieve climate resilience across our country. And of course, you all are very much involved in that. What are some sort of straightforward adaptation approaches we can take, and we already are taking in many places? Well, one of the big challenges here will be coping with this excess rainfall that we'll be getting in winter and spring. It's possible we'll also get heavier. Well, it's projected that we'll also get heavier rainfall events in summer. We expect our extreme precipitation to continue to become more extreme. And so figuring out ways to slow down the runoff becomes increasingly important, whether it's rain gardens and bioswales that are able to really slow down runoff from a given, say, parking lot or area, whether it's pervious pavement that could cover large areas and minimize the amount of runoff. On farms, nutrient stewardship becomes important, where you're thinking about putting your nutrients in the fields, not too early or not too late. You're putting them in at the right time, the right place where the plants are going to get it, not where it's going to run off. Basically figuring out making sure you're just putting in nutrients that are going to be destined for the plants and not for the creeks. That becomes increasingly important with heavier rainfall and more rainfall in the spring. Thinking about our different insurance options and whether the insurance options should change in a changed climate future, that becomes important. And thinking about whether we need to be buffering existing systems against impacts or just relocating infrastructure that we have to avoid those impacts altogether in the future. These are all things we need to be thinking about sort of on the watershed scale. I want to talk a bit about mitigation, which is minimizing the changes that we're going to see, because I think that's the actions that we take to mitigate climate change are going to have real implications for what our state looks like, what our country looks like, what's on the ground, and what we're designing around. There are some exciting trends, of course, on the mitigation side. We have basically carbon-free energies getting cheaper. Our energy systems are already starting to change to take advantage of that. And with the big changes that are likely to happen on the ground, we're going to need to move quickly to avoid the impact of just the new energy system that we're creating, to minimize the problems that will lead to. But there are going to be barriers to moving quickly, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit as well. So this graph here shows what's called the levelized cost of energy, which is basically the amount of the cost of energy from a given type of generation facility across the entire life of that facility. So if you look at the average cost of energy that, in this case, say a utility scale solar photovoltaic plant provided back in 2009, that cost was $359 per megawatt hour. What this graph shows is that by last year, that cost had fallen by about 90%, down to $37 per megawatt hour. Just a massive, massive change, a massive drop, really, in the cost of energy generated that way, solar energy. Over the similar time frame, the cost of energy generated by wind farms has dropped by about 2/3. So from $135 to $40 per megawatt hour. And the cost of gas has dropped as well, but not nearly as dramatically. Gases or electricity from gas that's burned in combined cycle plants. And the cost of energy generated from coal has held about steady. So what this means is that the renewable sources of energy are now the cheapest sources of energy in most of the country and really in most of the world. And so there's an economic reason to transition to solar and wind. And so for economic reasons alone, there should be a shift. Solar energy and wind energy now are often cheaper to, it's cheaper to build a whole new facility that generates energy that way than it is to just continue generating energy from a coal-fired power plant in many, many different cases in most of the country at this point. Now, obviously, there are challenges with solar and wind, and a lot of those challenges have to do with the fact that they're variable, that you can't control, well, you can't guarantee that there's going to be a certain amount of output from a given solar plant at any given time. And in fact, if it's going to be nighttime, you can pretty much guarantee there's not going to be any output from that solar plant, right? So, so dealing with that, dealing with the variability of those power sources is a challenge, and they can't be everything that we use. There are other carbon-free sources of energy, and lots of people would say, well, how about nuclear, right? We could just maybe rely on that. And I'm going to add in nuclear here. I don't have the 2020 numbers for it, but in 2019, you can see that the challenge is that the cost of energy from a nuclear plant was about 4 times as much as it was for renewable energy. So it's an expensive form of energy. It is carbon-free, essentially. It's not changing the climate like coal or gas, but it's not cheap either. And so that's one challenge going forward. And maybe technology could, new technologies can bring that down, but that's not going to happen overnight. So I'll show you one other encouraging trend, though, that could maybe help with this problem somewhat, which is that battery prices have dropped dramatically over the same period. So not quite as dramatically as the price of solar, but not too far off. We see that the dollars per kilowatt hour for lithium-ion batteries have gone from almost $1,200 per kilowatt hour of storage to $156 per kilowatt hour of storage in 2019. This has certainly made electric cars much more affordable than they would have been in the past, but it's also enabling utility scale energy storage so that utilities can use enormous batteries to help balance out the load on their system and do a variety of other things as well that basically increase the quality of the electricity that they're able to deliver. So, so this is an important change. This on its own is not likely to solve the problem of variability in a major way anytime soon, but it can help a lot. It can allow much greater penetration of renewables into the market, or much greater dependence on renewables than we would have otherwise. But it doesn't mean we can get to 100% or even very close to 100% anytime soon. But it is certainly a positive change that allows us to get larger penetration than we would otherwise. And so these changes in prices and in battery storage have led to a dramatic increase in utility scale photovoltaic projects across the landscape. So here you're seeing on a background of the amount of solar energy that is available in any part of the country, you're seeing the growth in these PV projects over time from 2007 up through 2019. And so you can see that there has been a real proliferation, especially in the last few years, of PV projects. And so we're getting much more electricity from the sun onto our grid now than we had in the past. We're also seeing a lot of wind farms going in, and we've seen that in Indiana for sure. In the top left here, you see the status of wind farms around the country, the locations of wind farms around the country as of July 2021. And on the right, you can see where the wind farms are in Indiana. If you haven't already seen them, driven by them, for instance, on 65, there are a bunch of wind farms that you drive through on the way from Indianapolis to Chicago. We can see that in Indiana, they're restricted to just a few areas, and that has to do with ordinances that have been passed in different counties that restrict where wind farms can go in. So there are some counties where it's easier to site wind farms than others, and that has led to real restrictions. And at the bottom figure here, you see, you can see just zoomed in farther, here's Lafayette, and you can see some of the wind farms that you drive through on I-65 and the locations of most of the other wind farms in the state here. So wind has been growing rapidly around the country during this time as well because of the decreasing cost. But I want to put this in the bigger picture of where we need to get to and where we actually are. So this graph shows our energy consumption globally, and what are the different sources that have led to our that produce the energy that we're using globally. Each of these sort of larger bars is made up of many small ones, and so you're seeing actually bars that show the energy consumption from each of these sources from 2000 to 2019 as you go across the larger bar here. So you can see the trend in time if you just look at how they've changed up top, and there's a little growth rate over the last 5 years of this graph that's shown here. So what we can see is that coal use has basically flattened out, meaning potentially decreased a little bit over the last 5 years. Energy coming from oil has been increasing. Energy coming from gas has been increasing. And those are the three dominant sources of our energy globally still. Nuclear has been more or less flat. Hydropower has been more or less flat, but here's these other renewables. Here are wind and solar primarily, and they are growing quite fast, 11.9% per year recently. But the challenge is that although these are the fastest growing energy source, they're not the only growing energy source. If we want to get to essentially net zero or zero emissions and depend on carbon-free energy that's not going to be changing our climate, those renewables have to replace all of these sources here on the left. They have to replace coal, oil, and gas, and not just the amount, these amounts that are already shown, but they have to replace the increases in energy demand that are going on in oil and gas going forward. So it's a big lift. There's a lot more carbon-free generation that needs to happen if we're going to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. So if we look just in the US at what our energy use looks like today, this is a Sankey diagram, which I love. They maybe seem a little bit complicated, but I'll just go through them sort of briefly here. This shows where we're using our energy on the right-hand side. We're using a lot of our energy in buildings and industry and transportation. And then if you trace them back to the left-hand side, it shows where that energy is coming from. And you can see that the main sources of energy that we depend on in the US are petroleum from the bottom up to natural gas and coal, some uranium for nuclear energy. And then above that in the top left corner, you see the little tiny bars that you'd be forgiven for missing entirely that show the renewable sources of solar and wind and hydropower. And those are the sources that need to grow. They need to replace these big bars down below if we're going to actually stop rapidly changing our climate here. The good news is there's a path forward. This is technically possible. We have the technologies to do this, and this is a vision for the future here that one group of researchers put forward, where we could supply the energy that we need in the future entirely with wind and solar and biomass, and a little bit of hydro and geothermal as well. But you know, we could make this shift and supply the needs that we have going forward. But again, this would entail a major increase in solar generation, a huge increase in wind generation, and a lot more reliance on biomass as well. This isn't the only solution to this problem, but this is, you know, one possible future. And we got to keep in mind, if we're looking at a huge transition like that, that it won't be easy for a variety of reasons. There are, first of all, there's big industries that are very much invested in our fossil fuel use, but then there's also people on the ground who don't necessarily want a solar plant in their backyard. And so this is taken by my extension colleague, Hans Schmitz. You know, he sees signs like this when he drives around Posey County, where he's based, people who may not want solar power plants. You know, there are people on the ground who just don't want to see that there, and so there are obstacles in the way of this transition for sure, and concerns, people's concerns that need to be taken account. And certainly there's similar concerns related to people living near wind farms. So how do you get to that solution? I think that's a huge hurdle that we need to figure out going forward. We certainly see other solutions in place. So maybe if you don't want a big industrial solar park near you, you don't mind so much if you don't mind so much if the airport puts a solar parking canopy over its big parking lots, as has happened in Evansville, Indiana. Of course, we have lots of roofs on buildings that are available to potentially put solar on. The challenge is that it's a bit more expensive to put a solar installation on a building than it is to just put it on an open field. And so there's a lot more to be negotiated, and it may not be quite as profitable or quite as straightforward for a utility to implement. So we have in our state of Indiana a grab bag of policies and ordinances mostly restricting renewables in the landscape, but this is evolving all the time. We have a 21st century energy, what the heck is it, Energy Policy Development Task Force or something like that, that's run by the legislature right now, that's underway, and it's slated to make recommendations to them at some point. So that could simplify things or not. We'll see what happens going forward. So I don't want to wrap up on this topic without mentioning some important resources that are available to people who want them. So first of all, I mentioned the Indiana Climate Change Impact Assessment. We have a bunch of different working groups on different topics that have been putting together technical papers and also more public-facing reports. The reports have been put available or made available as they've been finished on this website at indianaclimate.org. The ones that are circled here in red are the ones that are available right now. You can go to the website and download them. I used mainly in this presentation information from the climate report, but there's good information in the urban green infrastructure that would be relevant to this crowd as well. And certainly I wouldn't exclude the information from the other reports. I think there's relevant information in several of them for you. Our water resources report, or water report, is, again, that should be coming out soon, but I've been doing that for longer than I'd like right now. We are putting together an infrastructure report where we're looking initially right now at things like wastewater treatment plants and their susceptibility to flooding in different locations. but it's going to be a while before that one's done, I'm afraid. So we have some reasonably new resources from Purdue Extension that you can check out if you're interested. This is a series that is hopefully going to help community and regional planners understand and prepare for climate change. It includes topics such as communication strategies. It has a summary of Indiana's climate and projected climate. And it says forthcoming here, but I'm pretty sure these are both out now. The Sustainable Land Use report and the Managing Stormwater report. So you can find those at the Purdue University Extension Education Store. If you type in the word climate change, all those reports should pop up. And I encourage you to check them out. And if you don't know about it already, I also encourage you to check out the Tipping Point Planner, another product from Purdue Extension. It's a web-based program that basically helps planners form watershed action plans. It has a set of visualization tools that can, well, obviously help visualize things, such as what natural resource assets are there, water quality issues that might be important to plan around and things like that. So those are the resources that I have available. I'm happy to talk about any of this stuff and other things now. Once again, I recommend that you go to indianaclimate.org to see any of the reports. You're welcome to contact me. Here's my email address and my Twitter handle, and our center is available on different social media sources at Purdue CCRC. So that's what I've got. I'm happy to take questions, and yeah, I hope this was useful for some of you.
What about Lake Michigan lake level rise?
Oh yeah, that's a really good and complex question, and everybody wants to know about Lake Michigan, of course. Well, everybody up north wants to know about Lake Michigan at least. So Lake Michigan is a bit of a challenge. So there are a couple things that are going on. First of all, in the winter and spring, as I mentioned, we're getting more precipitation than we used to. And so that would lead you to think that we're going to have increasing lake levels, as we've seen over the past few years. More water should mean more higher lake levels, right? Well, not necessarily, because during the summer it's warmer, and well, during all times of year it's going to be warmer. And that means two things. One is more evaporation off the water because it's warmer. And second of all, less ice cover. So there will be a shorter period of time when the lake is covered by ice. When there's a cap of ice on the lake, that also prevents evaporation or limits evaporation at least. And so there's basically going to be a longer time of year when water from the lake can evaporate, and it'll evaporate faster on average than it has in the past. But more water will be coming in. So what we think is the upshot of that is that there will be larger fluctuations in lake levels over time. Not necessarily a long-term increase or decrease in lake levels, but possibly more fluctuations like we've seen over the past, well, decade or more, going from some extreme low periods to the more recent extreme high periods.
Okay, I don't see any more questions at this time. I guess I have one small question that may or may not be answerable because it's a little bit detailed, but in terms of endangered species, for our transportation projects, we need to, mitigate and watch out for those, particularly, Indiana bat, the rusty patch bumblebee, etc. Do you have any comments in regards to those endangered species going forward and how those might be impacted?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. One thing that I think about regarding bees and insects is that there may be new opportunities for creating habitat for those species associated with some of these solar farm installations that are going in. So you can imagine that solar panels can be put on the ground with lots of different things underneath them. You could have just basically like a manicured lawn, like is basically seen out at the Indianapolis airport and those solar fields. Or more and more now, for very low expense, people are planting pollinator-friendly habitat with those solar farms. So the vegetation has to be low statured if the solar panels are going to be close to the ground. But you can plant a variety of native species, a variety of species that have value to pollinators that are going to generate nectar and pollen that they can use, they can sustain their populations on or grow their populations on. So you could be tweaking the design of the plants, the plant species, the plant community that goes in with these solar farms to try to boost the population of whatever insect species you want. So there's an opportunity there, I think, to try to boost some of these populations and also to create maybe more connectivity across the landscape for things like monarch butterflies. So there just needs to be, I think, some creative thinking about what side benefits can we get from these solar installations. The bats, I would say, pose a bit of a challenge in part because of the wind farms. The wind farms that are going in are certainly threats to birds and bats. There has been a lot of work to try to figure out how to minimize that threat by, for instance, feathering the blades or basically turning off the turbines when the wind speeds are relatively slow. When those are the times when birds and bats are most likely to be flying around the blades. They're not going to be flying as much in high winds typically. And those are also the times when the wind farms aren't generating that much electricity anyway. So if you can basically turn off the farms when the wind conditions are such that the turbines are going to be most dangerous to flying wildlife, that can minimize the damage from them. There's also a lot of work going on like whether you can make little tweaks to the blades, to the color, to the shape, to the sort of their interaction with the airflow around them, that are going to ward off any animals like birds and bats and keep them safe. So that's I guess another way that there's some interplay here. And then another way that there may be interplay has to do with the possibility that we're going to get some legislation either at the federal level or at the state level that makes it easier for landowners to make money from essentially storing carbon on the landscape. So the Growing Climate Solutions Act could make it easier for would really make it easier for landowners to enroll their land in a program that could, say, for instance, encourage them to grow forest on it, and by matching them up with people who are willing to purchase carbon offsets from them. So basically, they could be making some money off of people trying to offset their emissions by growing forests. And if at the same time they happen to be growing forests that are viable bat habitat, then all the better. That might not be something that's going to help in the short term, but that might be useful in the longer term in terms of increasing the amount of habitat. In the short term, it might actually help protect a little bit of the Indiana bat habitat. So yeah, I think there are threats and opportunities on the bat front, at least from these sort of climate change issues.
Okay.
Anyway, long-winded answer, but hopefully that gets at your question a little bit.
Certainly. I see another question here. Retention and detention ponds have been noted as increasing humidity in the Great Lakes region. What mitigation measures would you recommend for on-site water retention that is not a pond?
A covered pond? Let's see. So I think there are different ways of it. Well, this is an interesting topic for a variety of reasons. Farmers are also, dealing with this potential challenge of having too much water sometimes of year and too little water other times of year. And so if they can find mechanisms to store water and use it later for irrigation, that could be beneficial. One of the challenges is going to be the economics on that, whether you can make it pencil out. But there are a variety of ways to store water on the landscape, and that's not my great expertise, but we have someone at Purdue, we have a few people at Purdue who are looking at these sorts of things. Jane Frankenberger is a professor here who's running this project called Transforming Drainage, and you can find the website at transformingdrainage.org. And they discuss some of this, at least in the agricultural context, of different ways you could be storing water from the winter and spring, essentially, to minimize runoff issues and to potentially be able to use that water in a productive way later. If you're talking about the agricultural context, then you have some tools available, such as if you have drainage tiles, you may be able to essentially turn on and off the drains from those tiles and retain the water in the soil. I mean, I think that if you're talking about retaining water not in a pond, basically then you're talking about retaining water underground somehow in the pores in the soil. And so you can do that. You can manipulate that by turning off drainage tiles. You've just got to be okay with having a higher water table under the plants in your field. Or you could have areas of a field where you're not as concerned about a high water table, and you could be essentially directing water there and sort of filling up your pore space in the ground there, even if you don't have surface water necessarily. You can have buffer strips that you allow to saturate or other regions. So I don't think people are probably going to be filling up big water balloons, but there are some of these other options that are maybe less intrusive and more practical.
Did you have any closing comments here? Anything else to say?
No, I mean, I just think I will say I think it's fantastic that that this group is thinking about these issues. I'm not a planner, and I'm not sure if I was able to provide the most useful information to you, but I think if I have just my main message or my main feeling is that it's really important to be thinking about this going forward when you're making decisions that are have consequences over the long term. It's really people like you who are making decisions today that are going to be influencing people's lives in 30 years or 40 years or more. You're the ones who have the opportunity to make climate change less of a problem than it would be otherwise. It's so important to know and be able to be in the mind frame that that today's climate is not yesterday's climate, and it's also not tomorrow's climate, right? That we can't use today's climate or yesterday's climate to plan for the future. We have to be thinking about what is the future climate going to be when we're making any sort of long-term decision that's going to be influenced by climate. And I want to emphasize that I don't have the perfect answers. Like I gave you some numbers today about what we might see changing in the future. I would not bet on any particular, like exactly a 5-degree increase by this time period, or exactly a 13% increase in summer precipitation. We don't know how much emissions we're going to have over the future, and our models are certainly not perfect in projecting what the future is going to look like. But when all the models are agreeing on certain things, like it's going to get warmer and it's going to get wetter certain times of year, then I think it's worth betting on that. It's certainly better to bet on those changes happening than it is to bet on no changes happening, because we know that that's not going to be the case, right? We know there is a change going on. So I guess I would just say thank you for the work you're doing, and to the extent that you can take these changes into account, you're gonna make people in the future and ourselves in the future very happy. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Dukes. I will say one thing that you've said that will be immediately beneficial to us in Tippecanoe County is we're going to embark on a project to amend our floodplain ordinance to discourage, if not outright prohibit, development in the 500-year floodplain, and we're expecting a lot of pushback on that. But I think you've suggested some materials here that will be helpful in that area, that effort. I think perhaps Bartholomew County is, as far as we can tell, the only other jurisdiction in the state that regulates the 500-year floodplain. But I think it's maybe time to get in front of that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you talk to people up in South Bend where they had however many, like 3,000-year floods in the course of a few years, you know, I think you'd have people saying that that's not a bad idea. I mean,
yeah,
you're going to save people a lot of headaches in the future by doing that now, I think.